Hi, my name is Atiyyah and I'm an arts journalist based in Cape Town. I guess I would say that my first work is in communicating between artists and the public, because I feel like a responsibility to write about the work that is being put out by musicians, filmmakers, theatre people. That's kind of always been my main role in terms of working as a journalist. And subsequent to that is just a complete obsession with music and all forms of art. So everything in my life comes down to the passion that I have for these forms, you know, which include writing about music, playing music, and, you know, dealing with artists all the time. So the zine is something that I created about a year ago. It was a way to play around with self-publishing and the idea of zines being forms of publications that came out during like a protest, you know, in the 70s, and also punk movements, and, you know, these mass-produced DIY forms of publication. And I was playing around with record covers that I had and liner notes, and I just kind of collaged them, stuck them together, and used poetry and that kind of thing. And that kind of is what the Bismillah Zine is. It's a publication based on my record collection that looks at records from North Africa or parts of Africa that kind of get ignored when we talk about African music. And then it was printed on risograph, which is an old analog kind of print machine from Japan, at Jazzuary in Cape Town. And I did a limited edition, thinking that it was just for experimentation. And then people were interested, so I did more. And now it's something that I kind of sell for super cheap or swap with people. And I also did a mix to go with it of all the music that's featured on the zine. So I have a DJ mix to go with it as an accompaniment to the publication. So most recently, especially under lockdown, I've had the opportunity to write a bit more because of other work falling through. And, you know, with journalism, it's always tough because you can't really go that long form because publications have a word limit. But when you start writing for online, you can kind of really go deep. So that's kind of been my process this year, is to kind of dig up things that have not been written about, do a lot of research, write longer. And so, for instance, I wrote about June 16th, about Youth Day, but not about Youth Day itself. It's just everything around it that is not really focused on. The story with Atiyyah is about the story of an artist from South Africa who doesn't really get a lot of attention. And she has this long career and a lot of albums, and she had her own her own label. So I think the focus is kind of, my focus is telling stories that are not really told. But also, because of our legacy of apartheid, we have thousands of stories that have yet to be written. So that's kind of the point with my writing, is to just kind of look at the alternatives out there, and then also write from the ground up. That's another thing that I have to do. It's like an imperative in my writing, is to not make the writing too academic or inaccessible, because it has to be for everyone. So the language has to be understood by everybody, and that's a really big, it's a really big thing for me. So the challenge there is figuring out how, you know, normally working in such an analog, hands-on medium, and now the plus is that you have all kinds of music to choose from because you're not limited to records, but also it's about developing your voice unique to yourself. And I think for me, the importance would be on, if I'm going to talk at all, it should be really about research. It should be a way to marry journalism and radio. And music and DJing, basically. That's how I see the show. I see the show as my journalism and my digging as a DJ coming together to provide context to some of the music that I'm playing. Also, it's really a nice way to focus on a lot of South African content. I'm kind of trying my best to focus on a lot of South African content, and also music from the continent, because we don't really know enough about that. Okay, so it's very hard to narrow down in any situation what my favorite records are, but these three, I'll just pick them out. The first one is Blue Notes for Johnny, which is a record. Very hard to find this album, and when you do find this album, it's gonna be really expensive. Actually, somebody gave this to me as a gift. So that's kind of like really special when people actually give you rare records. It almost never happens. But the Blue Notes, amazing South African jazz band that existed. They were in exile for a while. And this is a record in tribute for Johnny Diani, who passed away a year before. So this came out in 1987. And the only surviving member, Louis Moholo, is a drummer. He lives in Cape Town in Langa, and he actually signed it for me. So it has to be one of my top albums, just as a record, you know, as an object, but also as a archival, document of time. So that's this one. The second one is this Yumasekela album, one of my favorites. I think it has a really hilarious album cover. It's called Colonial Man, and except for one track, almost all the tracks on here, all the songs are like about colonizers who colonized South Africa. So there's Queen Victoria, Cecil John Rhodes, Vasco da Gama. I just think it's amazing that Yumasekela made this album. Also, I bought it for super cheap in some store overseas. But it's also really, really musical. So it's one of my favorite albums to play. I think it's a must in anybody's collection. The last one is a record from Niger, a guy called Hama, and the album name is Tarodi, and it's from a label called Sahel Sounds, which is a label that puts out a lot of content from North Africa, but it's part of uncovering music from the rest of the continent. Like, you would never really hear it anywhere else, you know, so it's hard to find. Because of South Africa's location, nobody really goes that far out, so it's really hard to know what other music is coming out from some parts of the continent. And this label, Sahel Sounds, is one of my favorite to collect. So pretty much everything they put out is really, really interesting. And I really recommend it to anyone out there who's interested in collecting records from the continent. And yeah, supporting artists that are not just from here. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about was the collective that I co-founded like 2013. And the point was to come together and listen to records, which is a medium I was not really familiar with, or vinyl. And at that point, it was not that easy to find it. But as I started collecting, it was myself and 5 other guys from different arts backgrounds, and we were just trying to get together and listen to music. And because I was working at a jazz club in Cape Town called the Mahogany Room, which was Straight No Chaser, I asked the owner, who was a drummer called Kesavan Naidu, who is a drummer still, if I could use the venue to do our sessions. So instead of doing it at somebody's house, I would do it at the jazz club. And so before we knew it, we had a gig. We had to call it something. We called it Future Nostalgia. And we had it every Tuesday night, and it was a very niche, small audience because we were playing a lot of jazz. But what was interesting about having a collective of 5 or 6 people was that display the album covers as we were playing the music. So as the tracks were playing, we would put the records up while we were DJing and then change the record covers as we would go. And so I myself, through that process, learned so much about music. Even though I was working as a music journalist, I could say that my education about music started after examining the records, because you see there's so much that's not on the internet, and you look at the back and you see who was playing, what year it came out in, where it's from, where it was pressed. The records over time became my encyclopedia books. They became my education, my textbooks, and still, like even now, like I continue to learn from them. So you have to understand that the internet is really limited, and everything we kind of want to engage with from the past, you can find through records. So the collective still continues, and we play all kinds of music, jazz, hip hop, dub, whatever. But the point is that we always have guests because we can't possibly know everything. So we always have someone come in and share the collection with us. But I would really say that if somebody's interested in looking at music in another way, records provide essential information. The only thing is, because of apartheid and the censorship, it's very hard to find South African music. That's actually really difficult. And in terms of jazz education, I think South Africa still has a long way to go because a lot of the tertiary institutions that we have are focused on the American catalog and history. And the problem is that a lot of the experienced jazz musicians do not have master degrees or PhDs, so they're not able to teach. So there's a disconnect in tertiary educations because only if you have those qualifications can you teach. But actually, there's a whole world of South African mentors and musicians who are able to share this knowledge. So I think the focus needs to move onto who are our legends and who are people that need to be honored by us and what are their stories, because it wasn't just Yuma Sekela and Miriam Makeba and Abdullah Ibrahim that need to be honored. There were like hundreds of people that were not talked about or written about. And as people pass away, so does the archive disappear. So that's why jazz education at all levels, even in schools, is really, really important.